Start off here. So, Jeremy Scahill, you're here for a movie called Dirty Wars, which also is the name of this great book you've also produced. And I haven't had a chance to read the book. I've read a lot about the book, but just seeing this movie, it really struck me as sort of a controlled, it was like a work of controlled anger and intensity and strong opinions about what is wrong with the it's like a really strong critique of the Obama administration, and maybe earlier, but especially now, the Obama administration's sort of stance towards foreign policy and how we deal with the world. So can you sort of explain, first off, I think the best way to get into this, maybe explain why the title and what are your basic gripes about the American government as it now proceeds?
Right. Well, first, thanks for having me. And, the title Dirty Wars, I wasn't trying to be like a master of the obvious in stating that there's no such thing as a clean war. But I think a lot of particularly liberals in the United States really believe that President Obama was going to roll back all of the Bush-Cheney, what they called their counterterror apparatus, and stop torture and close Guantanamo and, bring back some semblance of law and order to U.S. war policy. And so as we've seen this sort of expansion of drone strikes, we've had this portrayal of the war as being somehow cleaner than it was the past 8 years. So
Sure.
I wanted to sort of push back against that and say, even if we're killing these individual terrorists, in the process of doing it, we're killing a lot of other innocent people and I think making new enemies. And it's in fact a very dirty war. But it also was a sort of tip of the hat in a macabre way to a different era in U.S. foreign policy when we were waging these dirty wars in Central and Latin America and supporting the Contras in Nicaragua or Battalion 316 in Honduras. And I think in a way we're moving out of the era of the Iraq occupation and into an era where we're going to have a lot more CIA covert action and JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command, the elite force of the military, doing things that are covert and far away from any effective congressional oversight. And we could talk about the issues I have with the way that these things are being waged right now, but I'm just giving a mouthful there. So
Sure. Okay, and so let's start again from a generalist point of view, from your average American who's reasonably informed, probably voted in the last election. He's thinking, okay, we've got these kick-ass covert operations. We got Osama bin Laden when no one thought we could, or it took us a long time, but they're successful things. This is the way we have to wage war. If Al-Qaeda and our war on terror, I know that phrase has been thrown out now, but that is the way we have to fight the war. We can't fight the war with traditional means. These guerrilla tactics, what is the problem with having an elite special force?
Well, I don't see any problem with having a force like JSOC. I mean, our nation has a right to defend itself, and we have people that do engage in plots against us that want to bring down our airplanes or may want to blow up our subways. I mean, we all saw what happened and watched in horror as the bombs hit the Boston Marathon. So, for me, as someone who's been in and out of these war zones for most of my adult life, what really struck me when President Obama came into office is how little things had actually changed. I mean, the Iraq drawdown plan was actually not Obama's. It was what was on Bush's desk the day he left office. And President Obama actually surged troops in Afghanistan. But I was more interested in the kind of war within the war. And we all know everything about all the details about the bin Laden raid. We know that there was a, Belgian Malinois named Cairo that was on the raid with them. And, we know that bin Laden was on the third floor of his apartment and what he was wearing and all of that. But we know very little about the thousands of other raids like that one that were conducted that same year. In fact, I quote in the book, one military official who says, I don't even think that was the most dangerous raid we did that night, the bin Laden raid.
Wow.
So I guess the point I'm getting at here is that ideally, you want to have forces that are capable of hunting down people that are plotting attacks against you. For me, the question is, under what laws are we going to do this? Do we want to have a permanently paramilitarized response to terrorism? Or do we want to view these things as crimes and try to seek out the perpetrators and bring them to justice? And, I firmly believe after years of doing this and traveling in Yemen, Somalia, Afghanistan, elsewhere, we're actually making more enemies than we're killing terrorists. And for me, that was really was at the heart of why I wanted to do this story, is that I felt like we're all sick and tired of living in a perpetual state of war. I mean, the country, I feel like we all, beyond what we lost in terms of 3,000 of our people being killed and then another 5,000 of our soldiers, I think people are just run down to the ground with this.
Yeah.
And a lot of the Republicans want President Obama. I mean, they're not going to be happy until he starts putting common criminals in Guantanamo. They want everyone classified as an enemy combatant and this hyper-militarized solution.
Right.
And what the reason why I focus on the case of this American guy Anwar al-Awlaki in the story is not because of who he is, but who we are as a nation. We should ultimately be judged on how we treat the most reprehensible of our citizens. So how our justice system functions is not tested when, the most popular or powerful people, where their sort of law-abidingness is tested. It's what do you do when you have someone who's a really terrible person? What are their rights? That's why we're America. And so if we're not going to treat someone like al-Awlaki, with some basic standard of justice or due process, then I think it says something about us as a society more than it does about him.
Now that is a crucial moment or section in your movie when you talk about al-Awlaki. Give us a little quick sort of a reminder of who he is and why you think what happened to him was an outrage.
Right. So Anwar al-Awlaki was an American citizen. He was born in New Mexico. And his father was a very well-respected academic from Yemen who was a Fulbright scholar in the U.S., and Anwar was born when his dad was getting his degrees in New Mexico, and he ended up being a government minister in Yemen, and Anwar lived for a number of years in the U.S. early on in his life. Then he went to Yemen, then he came back to the U.S. for college. He got politicized around the '91 Gulf War. At the time, he was studying engineering. He gets invited as part of an anti-war group that he was with to speak at a mosque, and he had never been a particularly religious guy, and ends up deciding he wants to become an imam. And on 9/11, he already was a very respected religious figure in Virginia and ran this huge mosque called Dar al-Hijra. And I remember I was a young radio producer after 9/11, and I remember trying to book Anwar al-Awlaki. Because I had seen him on PBS and heard him on NPR and read about him in the Washington Post. And what he was basically saying after 9/11 is that Muslim Americans, like all Americans, condemn what happened. We want the perpetrators brought to justice. And he was sort of viewed as a moderate imam who was simultaneously condemning 9/11, but also warning against declaring war against the religion of Islam.
Right. He was a good moderate.
He was right. And he was a media star. This is funny. I mean, it's mentioned in passing in the film, but he was invited to speak at a luncheon at the Pentagon. And so he goes and actually gives a speech at the Pentagon after 9/11. 10 years later, Obama's trying to kill him around the world, but he actually gave a speech at the Pentagon and did a prayer service in the Capitol. And the short of it is that he got radicalized by the expansion of the wars. When the U.S. invaded Iraq, we found out what happened at Abu Ghraib. We saw what was happening at Guantanamo, and his sermons started to become more and more radical. And he left the United States and ends up in Yemen as a full-blown sort of radical calling for jihad against the United States. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of smoke around him, and through leaks to the press, we understand that he had met with the underwear bomber who tried to bring down an airplane over Detroit on Christmas Day. He had been in email touch with the Fort Hood shooter, Nidal Hassan, although in that case, intelligence agents decided that he wasn't involved with the planning of it. But there was a lot of smoke around this guy. And, I think it's quite possible al-Awlaki was engaged in all sorts of nefarious activity, but no evidence was ever publicly presented. And so I became sort of obsessed with this idea in early 2010 that a constitutional law professor by trade who won the Nobel Peace Prize and was a popular Democratic president actually was going to assassinate a U.S. citizen who hadn't even been charged with a crime. And so I set out to try to find al-Awlaki, and when we were shooting the film, al-Awlaki ended up getting killed in a drone strike on September 30th, 2011. So that's a big part of our story.
Yeah, and the thing is that you are outraged because basically it was like an assassination hit on an American citizen. Now, do you have no sympathy for those who would argue that, well, listen, he may have been an American citizen, but he wasn't exactly on American soil, and he was advocating all sorts of horrible things. Like, he may not have brought about the Fort Hood shooting, but he praised the guy, who
after the fact,
who was accused of it. He was, in effect, calling it jihad on the United States. Do we not have, at least if you think of it in terms of war, a right to go after a guy like that?
Right. I mean, if you look at how we've responded to other incidents, most of the successful prosecutions of terrorists done since 9/11 have been through our civilian justice system, where evidence is presented against them. We have an indictment. They go to prison. I mean, the Republican, macabre opposite Disneyland that is Guantanamo hasn't resulted in anything except hunger strikes, radicalization of people, and a bunch of folks who've already been cleared for release rotting away in that prison. So, I mean, I'm a firm believer in using our robust justice system. I would have sympathy for people who said, we needed to take him out if he was in Afghanistan shooting at U.S. soldiers. But let's remember John Walker Lind, who fought alongside, took up arms against his own country,
Sure,
and fought alongside the Taliban in an operation where a CIA agent ended up being killed very early on in the war. He was treated to a civilian trial. He ended up pleading out in it, but he would have had his day in court. So, I don't think that it's a defensible position to say that someone in Yemen, who to our knowledge has never fired a round at a U.S. citizen or a bullet at a U.S. soldier, the idea that he would be sentenced to death before he was being charged with a crime was crossing a line. And it's not about who al-Awlaki is; it's about who we are that matters to me.
no, I think that's a solid argument. Would you have supported a covert operation by our special forces to kidnap him out of Yemen and bring him back to the United States for a trial?
I'll give you a half yes on that.
Okay.
What I think, and look, I was just talking to a friend the other day who is a retired senior FBI agent who was involved with tracking these guys, the perpetrators of 9/11 and the leaders of Al Qaeda, and he said to me that he thinks that the Obama administration made a disastrous move in either in not indicting al-Awlaki or after the fact presenting evidence as to why they didn't want to indict him. In other words, he was involved with these plots. We didn't want to help the enemy, and therefore we had to preemptively take him out. There could be an argument to be made that that the Obama administration was justified in doing this. We just haven't seen it.
Yeah.
So you asked me about a special ops raid. If the Obama administration had indicted him, if Yemen wasn't going to extradite him, then I think the United States would have had a right to go in, snatch him, and render him back to the U.S. Obama does this all the time, that we render people, that have been implicated in plots against us, often with the cooperation of local governments, but sometimes without it. And I think we have a right to bring people to justice. I just don't think that we handled this in a way that is worthy of our democratic republic. And that, for me, is the main issue with it.
And even more outraged, I think you are by what happened to his son.
Well, that's just a horrifying story. I mean, I got to know this family very well. And, look, the al-Awlakis, Anwar al-Awlaki's parents are upstanding citizens who admire and love the United States. And it's really, you can see it in their faces when they talk about it. I mean, they really adored America, and they wanted their kids to be raised. Initially, they wanted to be raised as Americans, but then they wanted them to be raised in the American tradition. And so when Anwar al-Awlaki went underground, when the U.S. really started to intensify the manhunt for him in 2009, he left his 3 children and his wife in the care of his parents, and he goes underground. So the CIA is hunting him down, the military is hunting him down. And his eldest son, this kid named Abdul Rahman, had been born in Denver, Colorado in 95. And he hadn't seen his dad for a number of years. He turns 16 and decides he's going to try to find his father. So he sneaks into his mom's room early in the morning. He steals the equivalent of about $40 from her purse and leaves a note apologizing for taking the money and says, I'm going to look for my father. So he takes a bus to the province of Shebwa, the scene of repeated drone attacks to try to kill his father. And this is in September of 2011. And he arrives there to wait for his dad. While he's there, his father is killed nowhere near Shebwa. He's killed in the north of Yemen. And so his grandparents call him and say, Abdul Rahman, it's over. Your father's dead. You have to come home. He couldn't come home because there was a revolution in Yemen at the time. It was the Arab Spring, and Yemenis were fighting to try to overthrow the government of Ali Abdel Aziz. So he has to kind of hang out in this rural area with his family members from his tribe. So one night he goes out after his father's been killed with his cousin and some of the younger tribes people, and they're sitting in this outdoor kind of makeshift restaurant when a drone appears above them and launches a missile and blows all of these kids up, including the 16-year-old American citizen. And in the aftermath of it, U.S. military officials said, well, they leaked word that he was 21 years old and called him a militant. And it turns out, the family produces the birth certificate from the state of Colorado. He's 16 years old. They implied that he sort of was involved with Al Qaeda. I mean, you look at this kid's Facebook page and what his interests were. He was into comic books and he was into rap music and he hung out in the square with the nonviolent revolutionaries. And I watched endless hours of home video. He was kind of a goofy, lanky, normal kid who had nothing to do with his dad. And, for me, I've sort of committed a good part of my life now to trying to figure out why this kid was killed. And, the Obama administration has never had to provide an answer on it. And, they say, oh, well, he was meeting with Al-Qaeda people and was collateral damage, or we were trying to kill this high-value target, but they've never produced evidence that they killed anyone except these kids at this restaurant. And so, to me, I feel a deep sense of personal shame as an American that we don't have an answer on this. And I feel like that family also deserves an answer. But again, it's also bigger than just this one hit. Like, what does it mean in our society when this popular Democratic president, who I think a lot of liberals enthusiastically support, is doing something that if a John McCain did it, they would be up in arms about? And that's what's sort of...
Let alone George Bush.
Well, yeah, and then George Bush. It's like people are calling for Bush's impeachment for torture and using secret prisons. So the kill capture policy has sort of just become kill. And I think part of it is because Obama doesn't know what to do with these people. If you catch them, do you give them access to our civilian justice system? He doesn't ever want to stick someone in Guantanamo because it undermines him politically. He can't ever recognize the legitimacy of Guantanamo. So, I think some of the Bush people I always imagine Dick Cheney sitting at his ranch in Wyoming sort of saying, this Obama guy is actually a pretty shrewd operator. He's better at our game than we are. So
yeah. In fact, I can't remember now who says it, if it's you or you have somebody else, saying that the Obama administration actually has been harder and harsher.
Oh, it's an operator. It's a guy we have a guy in there who works on these kill teams, and his identity is shaded in our film, and he worked under both Bush and Obama. And he says, I asked him at one point, so, you're saying that under President Obama, you guys are able to hit harder. And he shoots back, harder, quicker, faster, with the full support of the White House. These forces have really been empowered. And, Obama had no real foreign policy experience, certainly didn't have military experience. So, imagine you're in his situation. He comes in to office. He gets all of these briefings about all of the plots happening against the United States. He's already staked out a position that he doesn't want to occupy countries. What do? Well, you meet guys like Admiral William McRaven and General Stanley McChrystal, who are the dark side forces for us. And they say, look, we can do all of this stuff discreetly. And in the case of the bin Laden raid, they go in, they take the target down, and they do it. And then Disney tries to trademark SEAL Team 6, and then Zero Dark 30. They madly sort of rearrange their script and then to make it this big Hollywood production. But most of what those guys do, we never hear about. They're taking down pirates, they're hunting drug cartels. There's no embedded journalists with them, and for the most part, we're not going to know anything about what they do.
And you just don't assume that they're doing good.
Well, I think there's two sides of the coin. I think that a lot of what JSOC has done, this elite force that's at the center of our film, is counterproliferation, counterterrorism. They're allowed to operate on U.S. soil. There's an exemption for them under the Posse Comitatus Act, which generally prohibits the military from engaging in law enforcement type activities. They do discreet security for the Olympics, for the inauguration. You could be looking at someone that you think is a local cop. They're actually a highly trained Navy SEAL. These guys take cover of other organizations, and I think a lot of what they do is aimed at keeping us safe. What we try to do in the film, though, is to show a different side of it, which is that sometimes this force that really is supposed to be used like a scalpel ends up being used like a sledgehammer. And what's the impact of that? Even if you kill, 2 terrorists in a building, but you kill 30 other people, is that a net victory, even for your stated goal of trying to tamp out an insurgency? Are you making more enemies than you're killing terrorists? To me, that's a question we should have asked long ago.
Yeah.
And part of it is that we have a bunch of lazy crooks in Congress. They don't do anything for any of us on anything. It's the economy. They're totally asleep at the wheel. They're too busy raising money from corporations for their next campaign. So,
there's so many things I want to touch on. I was wondering, it was interesting for me because I was watching your movie in the midst of the Boston Marathon bombing case, and all of the sympathy that I think I might have had, and the film seems engineered for us to have for Alaki's 16-year-old son. Oh, he was an American. He loved comic books and all that. It was amazing how much he sounded like, Jahar Tsarnaev. I was wondering if the Boston Marathon bombings, what your take is on them, given your sort of worldview about how outrageous some of our activities are.
Right. Before I answer that, I just want to say that I want whoever did that to be brought to justice and to face the full force of, our laws to deal with them. But I'm a big believer in not militarizing our solutions. I was very glad that President Obama decided not to classify him as an enemy combatant. I think that would have been a huge mistake. There's a lot of speculation. I think one of the most shameful things that's happened is what the New York Post did, putting pictures of this kid who was a high school track star just apparently because he was a person of color, or looked like he may have been a Muslim, whatever that means, on the cover of the paper and implying that he was who the FBI was hunting. And, you watch CNN's coverage, I mean, atrocious how many different leads turned out to just not be true. But I believe that, we have to wait to see the evidence against these guys. I sympathize with what you're saying. I mean, the story of Jahar doesn't add up. I mean, this kid, apparently was like a big pot smoker, and he went to class the next day, and he's partying with his friends. And, his brother, from all we've heard, seems like a total thug, and, wouldn't surprise me if he was, in fact, the guy who did it. But it's going to be a fascinating process, whether it goes to trial or there's a plea bargain, to see it pan out. Having said that, I think we're going to face acts of terrorism on our soil in the coming years. And I think some of it is going to be motivated by our drone wars, or by the perception that we're sort of waging war against Islam. Remember that the current generation of young Pakistanis, Somalis, Yemenis, Afghans, they're growing up in a world where all the United States has represented to them is a perpetual state of war. And that mentality will cut very deep. And if you've lost family members to a drone bombing or something else, and you have an actual legitimate reason to want to fight the United States, that's going to be very powerful. Revenge is a powerful motivator. And so I'm really concerned that this is going to come back, a boomerang back around to our shores. There will be blowback for what we've done. And I just feel like we haven't had the right conversation about what an actual national security policy would look like.
See, drones are a perfect solution for Americans because it doesn't involve American troops. So no deaths happen to our, young men and women. But the thing is, what your film is all about is the consequences of these drone attacks on, they're not our enemy. They are collateral damage, as some people might say.
I mean, I have a buddy who was a drone pilot, and he worked out of a U.S. base in the southwest of the U.S., and so he would operate drones that were flying over Pakistan or elsewhere. And he would, he'd spend his days or sometimes his nights engaged in war, sitting in a trailer on a U.S. military base in, halfway across the world.
Yeah.
And he told me that when he would leave work, he'd drive his SUV off the base, that he would pass a sign every day that said, "Buckle up, this is the most dangerous part of your day." Meaning that the worst thing that could happen to him is he'd get into a car accident, even though he's bombing someone across the world.
Yeah.
I think a lot of Americans, feel like, well, this Obama's smart, doing this smarter. If we're not subjecting our young men and women to, death in these war zones, and we're able to kill the terrorists, that's the way we should be doing it.
Yeah.
And, and I understand. I mean, look, we've lost more than 5,000 U.S. soldiers in these wars. The only people that are paying attention to this stuff right now, for the most part in America, are military families. Like Afghanistan is long forgotten. And I mean, I actually, even though my politics may be different than those of a lot of people who have family members in the military, I find a common ground when I talk to military families because they live this every day of their lives. For them, it's very, very real. And I think part of our system should dictate that all of us should have an investment in what our military is doing around the world. Financially, we're paying for it, but also on a moral level, what kind of nation do we want to have? And it's not fair that the million or so families whose loved ones are deployed in these wars, that they're the only ones that ever have to think about this on a daily basis. So we ended our film on a series of questions, about what happens when you see what's hidden in plain sight. What do we lose when one of our own citizens is droned and they haven't had a trial? Because we want to start a conversation. If you and I were talking 10 years ago, I probably would have said, oh, what we need to do is X, Y, and Z. I was a bullheaded kid. Now I think that, the best we can hope for is to expand the debate or discussion that unfortunately is just being had in small circles and in a lot of military families. Yeah.
Two slightly off-topic questions to end the conversation. One is, are you at all familiar with the Robert Bale's case? He's a local. I mean, he's from Fort Lewis, and he's being prosecuted for the massacre of an Afghani village, I guess. Anything about your understanding of that case that you could bring to light from your point of view, however you understand the world, how these things can happen, whether he's guilty or not?
Yeah, I mean, setting aside because he hasn't gone through the full justice process yet. I mean, what I'll say in a more general sense, this friend of mine, Dan Krause, made a great film called The Kill Team, which premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival and won awards there. And I mean, I know that this is all a very competitive world, but I'm not a filmmaker, and I believe in promoting other people's work. I think every American should see that film because really what it's about is the difference between killing and murder. And, a lot of killing happens in war. But murder is something different. And, I think there's a lot of murder that goes on in these wars that we don't know about. And his movie is about this one unit of guys who went around and set up Afghans to make it seem as though they had been in battle with them. But really what they were doing were sort of initiating younger soldiers, almost a grotesque hazing ritual where they would kill people, blame it on an ambush that never happened, and then cut body parts of theirs off and kept them as trophies. In the Bale's case, I don't know what happened, but I do know that we have not fully addressed the extent of the impact of PTSD, of post-traumatic stress disorder, or what it does to someone when they are in multiple tours of duty in these countries. Like, what provokes a man to slaughter a family? What is it that's going on in their head? What are we as a society going to do when all of these men and women come home and domestic violence starts shooting up, or they can't hold a steady job? I remember, when I worked at a homeless shelter in the 90s in Washington, D.C., and I was taking care of a lot of homeless vets, Vietnam vets. And I was a kid, basically, but I would take them to doctor's appointments or to fill out their paperwork. And I remember being so struck at how shell-shocked these guys remain decades after they had been in Vietnam. It forever alters them.
Yeah.
And I think, one of the greatest senses of shame we should all have in our society is how we've treated the men and women that have gone to these wars when they come back home. So I don't know what the story is with Bale's. There are competing narratives, but I do know that a heck of a lot of murder goes on in war zones that we know almost nothing about.
And final question: you've become something of a celebrity investigative journalist. I mean, you are the star of your own movie. You've got. I know you think of yourself more as a reporter and as a book writer, an author. But I was just wondering if you're in danger of your celebrity sort of getting in the way of your journalism at this point, because you're
terrifying me. It's like my worst nightmare. I mean, it's like being outed as a spy or something.
Right.
It's like, okay, good luck to going back there without the bad guys kidnapping you. I mean, it's weird. I mean, being at Sundance and being interviewed by like these women with big hair and fur creatures on them that are masquerading as a coat or whatever, and with such probing questions as, so Sundance is a strange experience. I had someone ask me about my film Dirty Horse once, and I was like, well, it's a sequel to War Horse, and it's it is weird, and as you can see, I start to fidget with my hand when you ask it, because I'm a writer for a reason. I don't want to be on camera. I go on TV to discuss stories that I've done, but I'm not a TV reporter, and I don't want to be a TV reporter any more than I want to see my mug on TV in the film. But I think people who see it will also, the writing of the film was an interesting process. I worked with this friend of mine, David Riker, who made a film called La Ciudad, and then The Girl recently starring Abby Cornish. And it was just supposed to be 2 weeks of David helping with the sort of framing of the story. And what ended up happening is that David would interview me for 5-6 hours a night.
Wow.
And over the course of months, he started sending me back things that I had said to him. And he said, what if we actually personalize this part of it, instead of just trying to act like, you're sort of an above it all superhero traveling from one place to another, but said, like, let's put some personality into it, and how do you actually feel about these things? We have a line in our film where I go back to Sana'a, Yemen, after the kid has been killed, after Abdul Rahman's been killed, where it says, was I there to investigate another crime, or was it to apologize? And that actually came from a conversation I had with David about what it's like to be a journalist in these countries where you're the only American that a victim of one of our bombings or something will ever see. And you feel a moral weight, like I'm an ambassador for my country too in these situations. So what do you say to a family who's lost everything because of men in camouflage who broke through their door one night that come from your country?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it's something I struggled with. I don't have no journalists are objective. It's all a myth. The New York Times isn't an objective paper. Judith Miller, who was writing these propaganda pieces for the Bush administration, she was a pro-war activist, basically. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm long ago stopped thinking about objectivity. It's about integrity. Do you trust that the person is telling you the truth? And part of telling the truth is to say, here's my bias in this game. And so by the end of our film, I think you see the disintegration of a reporter's sense that he's just telling the he said she said story, and that that was the biggest challenge of it.
Okay, then I have to ask one last personal question, which is great. You go back home to Brooklyn. I have a daughter who lives in Brooklyn and Bushwick. I mean, I love Brooklyn.
She's a hipster then, man.
Yeah, she is a hipster.
Yeah,
She's
exactly.
25 years old and
living the life in Bushwick. They have the Bushwick Country Club, which is anything but a country club. You should ask her about it.
Is that right? Okay.
Mini golf course in the back. It's highly luxurious. The champagne of beers is on tap there. It's anyway. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Well, that's perfect. But no, but you say a great line that reminds me of the main character in The Hurt Locker, which is he goes back home and he realizes he misses the adrenaline rush of war. I think of that in terms of soldiers, but you seem to imply that that happens to you as a journalist, being a frontline journalist.
I mean, you become a disaster in your personal life, and it's true. I know this of myself and a lot of other people. It's very hard to relate to your buddies. You're out and you're trying to have some beers at a bar, or people want to go to a concert, and you find yourself in just kind of zoning out because part of you just feels kind of dead. And I don't think this is a good thing, but I have the most alive that I've felt in the past 10 years. It's always been when I've been in a war zone or around people where there's that kind of action. And, there are some journalists that become adrenaline junkies, and that's not me. I'm not an adrenaline junkie, but it's almost like sort of my eyes are never open more wide, or my senses more sharp than when I'm in those situations. And then you come home. I mean, in my neighborhood in Park Slope, Brooklyn, it's like baby strollers galore, and all these cafes, and I joke that the baby strollers have like these spikes that pop out to try to take out the ankles of any non-breeders in the area.
You wish.
But it is tough. I mean, it's you have moments then where you kind of go into I don't know if it's PTSD or what, but you go into this zone where you're like, where am I? You don't feel right. And that's, we try to convey that to some degree. I think a lot of journalists that have done this will relate to that.
Yeah. Well, I'm just happy for the rest of us who don't live on the front line that you're willing to still do this and sort of devote your life to it, because it's a hell of a job, and you do a hell of a good job at it.
Well, thank you.
Congratulations.
It was an honor to be with you.
Great. Cool.